We would like to welcome you to the second night of IB Week. I'm Jeff Michaelman. I'm one of the directors of the flagship program in international business, and we would like to welcome you here this evening. An event like this does not happen without the hard work of a lot of people, and so first and foremost, I do want to thank the IB flagship staff and the student volunteers who have helped us put this event on. Secondly, I really would like to thank the speakers, including Dr. Watson and then Dr. Steinman, who will speak later, because through their generosity, we're able to make available to you such high-quality presentations. To introduce tonight's first speaker is Dr. Bruce Cavan. Dr. Cavan is the Bank of America Professor of Information Technology and Chairman of our Department of Management, and I would like to now give you Dr. Cavan.
It's indeed an honor tonight to present to you our guest speaker, who has been a very good friend of mine and my mentor over the years, and a good friend and colleague. He actually, although I'm older than he is, he actually served on my dissertation committee for my doctorate. Rick Watson is the Fuqua Distinguished Chair of Strategy at the Department of MIS at the University of Georgia. Rick's a Fulbright scholar. He received his PhD at University of Minnesota, which is ground zero for IS. So his has an extremely good pedigree. I don't know how many publications he has. I would guess maybe 200 or plus journal articles. Thereabouts. But he's just a great friend. His wife, Claire, is in the back. They have 3 adult children. 2 living in New York City and 1 on the West Coast, all active internet users. And I'd like to welcome my good friend, Rick Watson. Thank you.
Well, good evening. As you might gather, I'm probably the only true Southerner, other than my wife, in the audience this evening. I'm so Southern I was born in South Australia. But I've been at Georgia for 20 years, and I've learned to say g'day y'all. So good evening and welcome to the talk this evening I'm going to give about globalization and information systems. This is the outline of the talk this evening. I'll first of all talk a little bit about globalization. Then I'll look at what are the fundamental enterprise and individual issues. This is not a talk full of facts. What I really want to look at are the important underlying ideas that you need to understand in this global world. The facts change, but the fundamentals don't. Then we'll look at global information exchange. How does this fit into globalization and information systems? And then I want to introduce something called the information drivers. What are the fundamental things that people want from information systems, and how do they fit into globalization and the sorts of systems that you will see in the near future? And then finally, I want to look forward. What are the sorts of problems that we face as a global society? So what's globalization? I see it as a synergy of trade and technology. These two things coming together. People have wanted to trade for many years. And technology is an important element of being able to trade, and you'll see that in a couple of slides. But what is globalization? Globalization means the free exchange of goods and products and services and the free flow of people unhindered by borders. In a truly global world, there'd be no passports, there'd be no barriers or borders. You would be able to move around the world, work anywhere, and trade with anybody. We are some distance from that particular goal, if it is a goal, but that's the definition of globalization. Now, how do trade and technology come together? Let's have a brief history of trade and see how globalization changes over time. So early on, about 5,000 years ago, the world was centered around the Middle East. Most people were still hunters and gatherers, but there were some cities there, and this was the beginning of trade, exchange between two groups, globalization at that point. The technology was very simple. People made a boat, created the frame of a boat, put skins around that boat, put a couple of donkeys on the boat, loaded it up with some grain and cloth in areas like Turkey, and floated down the rivers, Euphrates and the Tigris. They got further down to where modern Baghdad is, sold the grain and cloth, purchased some skins, disassembled their boat, packed it on the 2 donkeys that they brought downstream with them, and then walked back to Turkey and then kept going through that cycle. That was their trading cycle. Their technology was really simple, a collapsible boat. Let's have a look at some other examples of where technology and trade fit together. The world was a smelly place for thousands of years. There were no sewage systems. People rarely bathed, and so what you wanted was something to disguise the smell of the everyday world. And it turns out that the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, you could grow frankincense and incense and perfumes and so forth, and traders would take them from that area and go up along the Red Sea and then sell them on the coast of the Mediterranean so they could be then shipped into Rome and places like that. What was the important technology? Well, when you look at this initially, you might think it's the camel. But actually the key technology is the saddle, because the saddle provides you with the capability of loading up those camels with quite a considerable amount of products and move through the desert. This particular photo is taken from Australia roughly 100 years ago, because they needed to use exactly the same technology to move wool from the sheep stations to the cities. Eventually those camels were left to go wild in Australia, and that's a source of camels these days which Australia exports to the Middle East. But here is the example of trade and technology going together. The trade to move the frankincense and so forth up to the Middle East area, the Lebanon area that we have today, and the technology being the saddle. Another important period of globalisation was medieval trade. And here we had trade from the European area right through to China. Not necessarily the same group of traders going the full distance, but trade occurring across that region and maybe a product exchanging hands many times. The technology that made this possible was the dhow, the Arab dhow. Now, the Europeans had boats, but the distinctive piece of this technology was the slanted sail, which meant that you could sail into the wind. And so the Arabs dominated the trade throughout the Indian Ocean. They could come down the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf and do the trade, pick up items that had been produced in China, such as silk, and then take them back along those particular routes, and they would end up in places like Venice and Genoa. And that was the technology that dominated trade then. Well, let's move forward to the present world and understand globalisation as it occurs today. Today, we're thinking of the free exchange of goods and products and services post the fall of the Berlin Wall. Prior to 1989, the world was divided into blocks. The Soviet bloc and a group of satellite countries collected around that, and another group collected around the United States and free trade and democracies and so forth. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the whole Soviet bloc collapsed. There was a recognition that the way to organise your economy was to use free market principles and democracy. Up to that point, there had been some disagreement as to the best way to organise an economy. Do you have a hierarchical command structure, such as the Soviet Union, or do you have an open free market system such as that we enjoy today? The technologies of globalisation today are free market capitalism and democracy, which generally comes with it, and information and communication technologies. The big change has been the internet and the sorts of technologies that have flowed from that to enable the sort of trade system that we have today, and that underlies the current form of globalisation. Let me give you an example of what globalisation means for some people in the world. So you're probably familiar with the idea that much of the manufacturing these days takes place in China. When I was on a trip to China about 18 months ago, we had the good fortune to visit a factory that makes pet cages. This was outside of a city called Dalian, which is probably the high-tech city of China. It's a place where Intel are about to spend $2 billion building a high-tech chip factory. And this particular pet cage factory is about an hour out of Dalian. You can see a photo there of the, whoops, need to go back one. You can see a photo there of the factory, the entrance to the factory. And then you can see the workers here. It's manually intensive. Labour is fairly cheap in China. These people get paid around about $4 to $5 per day. You don't want to use robots as you might use in the US. It's much better to have people putting things together as you see here. In fact, it's a much more flexible form of organising production because you can reprogram people very quickly. It takes much longer to reprogram a robot. And of course, people can make adjustments along the way when you give them a new system of organisation. Most of these people come from rural areas of China. It's not a particularly nice life to work planting rice and harvesting rice. They would much prefer a job in a factory. But then you look at the sort of facilities they have. This is the typical room. That's one half of a room, and you have 8 people living in that room, and this is the space that they have for their personal belongings. And they would be there most of the year. They would go home around about this time of the year, probably a couple of weeks earlier, because it's the Chinese New Year. And then there are some guidelines for factory operation and so forth. This particular factory was set up with the help of a US company, and in order to have competition, it has 3 factories like this with different owners in the Dalian area. This is globalisation for some people. It's a great experience to take your students there and say, if you don't get good grades, you'll be working in this factory for $4 or $5 a day. But this is globalisation for many people. This is good globalisation because they have jobs and steady employment in a decent working environment. Today, globalisation is highly dependent upon information systems. This is the way we can coordinate the activities of many organisations around the world. In fact, information is the most globalised of goods. Bits don't stop at the border to pay tariffs. They flow freely from one country to another. There's a very low cost to transport information. It's very low cost to make telephone calls. In the 1930s, it cost something like the equivalent of $300 to make a 3-minute telephone call from the US to the UK. These days, many of us make those equivalent phone calls for free using something like Skype. Information work is readily moved from one part of the world to another. Let me give you a simple example. When the US Postal Service gets a letter that has been handwritten, somebody has to read that writing and key in the zip code so that it can be automatically sorted, that particular letter. So how do they do it? Well, they take a photo of the letter and they transmit that photo somewhere else. Somebody sees it and then codes in the postal code. Once you have the internet and modern information technologies, that work can be done in the next city, the next room, or halfway around the world. So information work is easily moved from one part of the world to another. It creates many opportunities for people in the developing economies, particularly those people who have some talents in information systems. What I would like to look at is what are the fundamental enterprise issues for information systems for a global organisation. This is a famous quadrant developed by Bartlett and Goschel to identify the 4 different types of international organisations or multi-country organisations. So we have on the vertical axis the degree of global coordination running from low to high, and horizontally the degree of national differentiation running from low to high. A global organisation has a choice of which of these quadrants to operate in. A good example of a company that operates in the global quadrant, that is high global coordination but low national differentiation, is Apple. The iPod that you get, or the iPhone that you get, doesn't really change much in different parts of the world. It's the same product. They might vary it slightly. So, for example, the French iPod has some controls on volume because of French law about the maximum volume that you can create. But generally, the products are exactly the same across the world. It has a single integrated enterprise resource planning system to manage the whole Apple organisation. This means that you can sit at your desk, you can order an iPod that's personally engraved, it will be manufactured in China and shipped to your home. Most of the coordination of the company is done out of California at Apple's headquarters there. At the other end, we have something like a multinational, which has high national differentiation. A good example here is Unilever. They produce different products for different parts of the world. They don't have a single, for example, cake of soap that they sell everywhere. They vary it with the different markets, as you will see in a minute. And then finally, we have the transnational. A good example here is Toyota, that tries to be globally coordinated, work out where to have activities in different parts of the world, and at the same time be responsive to local markets. So what's the purpose of an information system? An information system has to do two important things for a global organisation. It has to support the operations and the decision-making of the enterprise's multi-country strategy. So let's have a look at how that might happen. The first thing to realise is there has to be a connection between strategies and systems. There are only three fundamental things that a system can do. It can handle the present, which is transaction processing, for example, making a reservation with an airline. It has to remember the past. Who made that reservation? Who owes you money? How many seats are booked on the airline? Those sorts of things. And then you have to analyse that sort of data so that you can prepare for the future. Which airline routes should we have in the future? What size plane should we have on those, and so forth. And it's a cycle. As you identify new systems, you build those and they help you handle the present, and then you remember the past and you go through that process. So we have strategies and then fundamental systems. So let's look at a global organisation. This is one that has high global coordination and low national differentiation. The focus here is very much on efficiency. Highly centralised, as in the Apple case. You seek economies of scale, so you might only have a few factories, maybe located in one area, so you get tremendous efficiencies from that. And the role of information systems is to send the right information for each employee to support this global coordination. So it's delivering information so the activities of the organisation are very well coordinated and highly efficient. The role of IS is to support coordination. If we have a look at the Apple site, the website, this is pretty clear that this is the focus of Apple. So here's the site for the US. I then went and looked at the Indian site. It's exactly the same. Apple's products don't vary around the world. It's very much focused on global efficiency and not local responsiveness. The only difference is in the URL of the websites. Let's have a look at another strategy. This is the one of the multinational. And you'll see in this case it's a company that focuses on low global coordination but high national differentiation. They focus on effectiveness, serving local customers well, producing the right products and services for each particular market. Let me give you an example of this. There's a famous brand called Lifebuoy. This is soap that Unilever have sold since 1895. It's sold as a basic hygiene product all around the world. The problem is that a bar of Lifebuoy soap is quite expensive for many people in India. Something like several million people suffer from dysentery in India every year. The basic way to solve this problem is to teach people to wash their hands. However, a cake of soap is too expensive for many poor people. Unilever eventually recognised that this was a problem. So it produced a cake of soap around about that size, which is approximately, in cost terms, the cost of a cup of tea. And then it taught poor people how to wash their hands. And as a result of that, you start to solve the problem of dysentery. This is a very good example of how a company is responsive to local markets. It doesn't produce one cake of soap for the world, but decides that in particular markets there is a need to be very responsive to local needs. In terms of information systems, you need the right information in the right format for each customer employee for each market. You need to be able to tailor the information to meet the needs of each particular local market. And here we're not talking about a particular country, but it might be a segment of that country. You also have to adapt to the culture, the economy, the infrastructure and the language. These are lots of changes that you have to make to your product in order to be nationally and locally responsive. In this case, you can use information systems to support national differentiation. So what I'm trying to get across is, from an information systems perspective, first you recognise the fundamental strategy of a global organisation, and then you fit your information systems to that. The global strategy drives the information systems. Well, let's have a look at the websites. This is the US website for Unilever, and this is the Indian one. Quite different from the case of Apple, where they were identical. In this case, there's considerable difference, and there's not much about it except for the brand that's consistent between the US and India. This is a company that is responsive to local market needs. Now the transnational. This is the organisation that tries to be both effective and efficient. It's trying to do both of these things at the same time. This is a major challenge to do that sort of coordination. What it wants to do is perform the right functions in each particular market, the right place for each particular market. It might localise around global platforms. And so we're going to have a look at Toyota in a minute and see how it does that. The role of information systems in this case is to coordinate and respond, to help the organisation share its knowledge, because when you're trying to be efficient and effective at the same time, you need to make certain that you get the right knowledge in each local marketplace and then spread that knowledge across the entire organisation so you can get some effectiveness, some efficiency I should say, by doing things well at a global level. If we look at Toyota, and we're not moving forward. It's gone to sleep. Well, as they say, this has never happened before, and we've got our best people working on a solution. All right, let me dispense with this. Go back to a manual system. Please be patient. All right, I'm going to have to reboot this. All right, hold it, we might be right. Okay, so here's the site for the Prius in the US. If we look at it for Japan, slightly different. Toyota have a global platform for each of their cars. This enables them to get efficiency, and then they tailor it for each local market. So the sorts of accessories that you might get in the US market can be different from the Japanese market. So they can get efficiency by a global platform, but then they can get local effectiveness by varying the situation for each economy. So we've looked at the fundamental ways in which organisations differ in their strategies, in the ways in which we can use information systems to address those. Now let's look at some fundamental individual issues and how they affect global information systems. There are two fundamental problems that you have as individuals. Bounded rationality. You have limited capacity to process information. Let me give you an example of that in real life. I gave a talk several years ago at Boca Raton, and my wife was with me and a friend. And the night before the talk, we went into the bar and we watched this magician doing tricks. And we thought, you know, we're smarter than this guy. He's probably getting paid $10 an hour to do these card tricks. All we have to do is watch this person intently and we can work out how he does the trick. So he does tricks for us for about 15 minutes. We watch him very carefully and we don't detect a thing. We haven't a clue how he does it. And in fact, we are so intent on watching him, at the end of the 15 minutes, he hands our watches to each of us. You have limited capacity to process all the signals from the environment. And if I can distract you and get your brain focused on a couple of things, you will miss a lot of other signals. You are designed to solve problems of reproduction and survival in the savannah of Africa. You are not designed to operate in this modern world. The oldest operating system around is the one between your ears. So this is a limitation that we have as humans. It's compounded by the fact that we live in an attention deficit society. We are continually bombarded by information. Attention is one of the scarcest resources in the modern world. Every advertiser is competing for your attention. So this is a fundamental individual issue, that we have bounded rationality in an information-intensive world. What does that mean? It means that technology has to do two things for us. First of all, it has to help amplify